Welcome to the Day Witness podcast. You're probably familiar with our She Witness podcast project, where we discuss a little bit about the domestic violence or violence in close relationships among minority women in Norway. So with the Day Witness podcast, we're hoping to reveal stories and share stories of discrimination in Norway experienced by immigrants. And today we have Seth Piper. Seth Piper today. Seth Piper grew up in Gloucestershire in the UK and moved to Norway in 2005 when he was 23. Seth became a Norwegian citizen in 2022. Congratulations. 7 years later than hoped. He works as a senior consultant for Be Bold, working with nonprofits in Norway and internationally, and has also worked with several political parties since 2016. Now, me and Seth, we have spoken a little bit before we came to this interview today and this conversation regarding his experience with discrimination. And I think I have to say that the more I talk about this topic with individuals, every individual has so many layers and multiple discrimination experiences. So this is something I want to highlight and really go in deeper to these different layers during the time and how that really impacts the individual. So let's start off. Maybe let's go with why you came to Norway in the first place, because that has a lot related to some of the discrimination experiences you told me.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. It was quite a long time ago now. So yeah, around 2004, 2005, I ended up moving to Norway from the UK for a bunch of reasons, but definitely one of the main reasons was having spent some time here, I just felt there was a great level of tolerance. So I'm gay, and at that time, it really wasn't a big deal for people that I was meeting here, and whereas people in the UK were still quite hung up on it. You know, quite a lot has changed in the last 2 decades. Technically speaking, I could have been fired from the last job I had in the UK. So UK discrimination law changed in 2004, I believe. But until then, my boss could have fired me because I was gay, and he was fully within his rights to do that.
Wow.
And I couldn't get married, any of those things. So yeah, it seemed like the right choice for me at that time.
And then, of course, you also met with discrimination. So what is the very first sort of memorable discrimination that you can remember in Norway?
Yeah, so this is really the very first time I'm speaking about discrimination for lots of reasons. You know, you want to project the image of being a success as a migrant. You know,
Yeah.
I'm proud of it, and it's a big part of who I am. And I think it's good for people to experience different cultures and move abroad. So, I also want to acknowledge the fact that I've had a lot of advantages being from the UK and being a man and being white and not having any disabilities. That has definitely given me a privilege, which I really want to acknowledge before I start talking about the negative sides of discrimination. I think in the very first years, you know, I was probably quite naive, and you know, it was a honeymoon period. I'm not sure if you...
Yeah. So if you go through like this culture shock, so you get this honeymoon and it goes to the next phase where you're kind of like, crap, you know, and then you had to adapt, and then, you know, it gets a little bit better, it depends, you know.
So, you know, most immigrants will realize they don't get the opportunities that anybody else does. But of course it could be, maybe it's the language, you don't have the network. So, you know, I worked really hard on that. I became fluent in Norwegian quite quickly. I built a network, you know, I worked really hard. I've always been lucky to find employment. But there's no doubt that I was definitely, you know, didn't have equality of opportunity despite that. But yeah, I made it work. You know, hustle culture. I think that most adult migrants will understand hustle culture. You just like grab an opportunity and run with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's only over time when you actually have a much deeper understanding of, you know, the society you're living in, and maybe become more mature. You know, I was very young. That you understand, as you said, how many dimensions there are to it, and how, you know, you would like to believe that you're being treated equally, but your own lived experience is telling you that sometimes you're not.
Because I mean, like, I think it's interesting, and I think like topic is so hard to talk about sometimes, because I think as immigrants we don't want to portray like we hate Norway or something, or we dislike Norway, but rather like, you know, we enjoy some of the aspects of Norway, but we also equally are experiencing some of the painful experiences, you know, to talk about, and I can understand it, because I think like you have also experienced discrimination in workplaces, and you know, even talking about it, I think it feels weird. And I think like you're not the first person I spoke to like going, yeah, but I'm white, you know, my experiences are not as bad as like a black person or a brown person. So why should I talk about it? And I think like we really need to address that. We shouldn't be comparing pains. I think we should acknowledge that everyone, you know, as the concept of intersectionality goes, you know, we all have different layers towards us, to our identity, and because of those parts of our identity is where sometimes we meet discrimination, and you're no different. So could you walk through the experience you had in a workplace when you experienced discrimination? How was it, and what was it?
I've got notes here. It's complex, you know. I've got one specific example I was planning to talk about today that I really haven't talked about before.
Take your time.
Yeah. So I was involved with an organization which I'd volunteered for, and I was also, I worked for. Over a course of about 5 years, I was under 3 different contracts, and I had, you know, a few quite critical, you know, had quite a critical central role in this organization. You know, and it wasn't easy for anyone. It was an organization in growth, and my role was also trying to kind of bring about some change, bring about professionalism, or, you know, introduce some new ideas. And there's always going to be resistance, no matter what your background is. But at the time, and now looking back, there were multiple instances repeatedly where I was experienced that my background was being used against me. So, you know, I would be told by colleagues, not all of my colleagues, but only sometimes, but, you know, in an open arena, that you don't understand this because you're not Norwegian. Or, you know, we shouldn't listen to you because you don't get it, you know. And of course, at this point, you know, I'd been in Norway for most of my adult life. I'd been hired to do a job, so I'm a professional. You know, somebody's made a judgment that I have the experience and the qualifications to be able to do my job. So, and then when you're met with that, in Norwegian they call, or discrimination has 2 words, discriminating, but also forskjellsbehandling, being treated differently.
Yeah.
You know, it really makes you stop and think, well, can I even do my job now? What do I do with this? And of course I just tried to shrug it off, and I acted like it didn't get to me. But over time it really eats away, you know, I had sleepless nights. It was, in the end I resigned from my position, you know, again for multiple reasons, but this was certainly, it was a really tough time, and it feels really unfair.
Have you actually spoken to them, spoken up, like say, you know, this is really unfair, you know, you hired me for this job here, and you're treating me, you know, as an outsider, you know, you should be sort of looking at that I'm bringing a new perspective here.
I mean, I certainly, you know, spoke about it informally to colleagues. I brought it up in meetings sometimes, you know, in my team. I was like, you know, why should I have to deal with this? But nobody said anything. Nobody jumped to my defense. Nobody told me I wasn't, and this is something that I would like to get into, because one thing that this happens, but I think maybe the more damaging part is actually when you end up basically being gaslit. People are telling you you're not experiencing what you're experiencing, or that it doesn't matter, or, you know, that you're choosing to make an issue of it. And so maybe you think maybe that's right. Maybe, you know, there's a professional context. Everybody has to put up with certain things. So maybe I just have to put up with this. But again, looking back, it feels like I really shouldn't have been accepting of it. And
did you talk to your friends about this, like outside of work, or did you have someone to lean on at the time?
So you mentioned a bit earlier, you know, I genuinely love Norway. I'm sat here saying about my hard experience, but like I chose to make Norway my home. I could live lots of places. I love Norway. This is where I feel safe, comfortable. I'm super proud of it. And I love my Norwegian friends, my friends with Norwegian backgrounds. you know, yeah, I do love them, but they mostly don't get it.
No.
I think that hearing about these things is difficult for them. It doesn't chime with their idea about how my experience should be. They want me, because they want me to have had a good experience. They don't want to face up to the kind of underbelly of it.
Right.
But the result is that, again, they have been dismissive. They have been telling me that I'm imagining it, or it's not so bad, or just not to care, you know, which comes from a well-meaning place. But the result is that, again, sometimes you feel like you're being gaslit by an entire country.
Yeah. And like you said, you end up having to quit because it was just getting too much as well. And then there was and yet you still went to another workplace, as far as I understood. Almost similar thing happened.
So the workplace I'm at now, yeah, I started together with a friend and colleague, you know, and basically we're sort of our own bosses. And so we create the workplace culture. Yeah. Not experienced anything bad there. You know, I'm a consultant. I'm brought in as an expert, and actually I think it's harder for people to challenge me in that role. I'm an external person.
Yeah.
And, you know, I have a lot of, when you call yourself an expert, and I am in my field, it's much harder for people to challenge.
Yeah. Because you work in communication.
So I work in marketing, but also like organizational development. I work often with like leadership in NGOs, and I help them like set a new course, make a new strategy, that kind of thing. So, and it's a huge privilege, by the way. I am a migrant, but I really get to work with what I choose to work with, you know, and I'm really proud of it.
And you also do a bit of recruiting as well, because I remember like there was one point where you were involved in the hiring process, and then you got to hear a lot of stuff that came out of that hiring process.
So I've been on the other side of the table in terms of recruitment, much more than I've been an applicant for jobs. So I've been involved with a hiring process where it's me and then typically some Norwegians. Well, when I say Norwegians, I mean people who've grown up here.
Yeah.
And I have seen the way they look through applications, and I see the kind of judgments they're making and what they're based on. And you know, I've had people say, you know, out loud, you know, I ask them, well, why are you not giving this person a chance? Well, it's because they've got a foreign name, or I don't recognize the university they went to, or maybe they don't speak Norwegian good enough. I know this is not based on anything; it's completely speculative. And then I asked, you know, well, isn't this a problem? Isn't this maybe why we have so little diversity in this organization, for example?
Right. Yeah.
And then I've heard things like, well, you know, I don't think it would be right to hire somebody that's not Norwegian anyway, because maybe they won't fit in. You know, maybe they won't know what to talk to everybody about around lunch, or the culture will be wrong. So it's kind of a gatekeeping again of workplaces. I do think also that the more competitive a position is, the more discrimination maybe is going on. They have an idea about who they want, and they want somebody like themselves.
Yeah.
You know, which is understandable, but also like, well, we see the result. It's beyond any doubt that systematic discrimination goes on.
And I think it's interesting that you basically saying that they're using this cultural fit to kind of discriminate. And often, you know, that is, because I've been through the hiring processes, and I've seen how the recruiters are kind of using this as well. Like, you know, it's also about, you know, neurodiversity, and they don't talk about race. You know, don't talk about the person's ethnicity. They talk about something outside of that, which makes them much more comfortable. You know, that I feel like that, you know, even diversity is kind of directing on more on the gender aspect. So it's kind of like, you know, white women coming in more in higher positions and so forth. So I think I don't know, I think it's really sad to hear that this is still kind of going on, and also that you have experienced it, and obviously had the privilege to hear it as well, because obviously, like you said, you're kind of passing as a white Norwegian, and I think that's where you do see that side, unfortunately, in the hiring process. I
would like to add that, you know, I've used my position. I've been hiring. I've had a lot of people, and I've definitely used my position to try and make up for, perhaps. You know, I've recruited fairly, but recruiting fairly actually means that you don't necessarily you always invite somebody to interview if they have the qualifications on paper that they seem to. you know. And there are studies that show that if you have anonymous job applications, then that really is one of the biggest things you can do to solve this informal application discrimination that goes on.
And I think like the statistics is that, you know, if you have a foreign name, you are, I think it was 25% or 30% less likely to get called in for an interview. So in your experience of working with large organizations who having such a big resistance to change, how do you navigate that? I mean, like you said that you were trying to make some changes. Do you think that there is some kind of hope in that kind of area, especially in the workplace environment?
You know, in my younger years, my even more idealistic, impatient years, you know, I always thought the best way to do it is just to call it out, address it directly, you know, force people to face up to it. And every time I hear about somebody doing that, I think, yeah, good on you. But to answer your question, over time, I think I've understood that to create meaningful change in an organization or in society, like there are so many steps, it takes time. You have to work with people, even if they're in the wrong, you know, it's up to them if you don't have them on board. So being pragmatic and patient, but that doesn't mean being, you know, you really have to demand meaningful change. Ultimately, I think a lot of this will be solved when we start seeing more diversity, especially in key positions, in positions of power, people who are hiring other people. I suspect that it's still in 2023 now, there's this sort of glass ceiling. If you aren't...
Oh, yeah. I'm feeling it.
Yeah, you need to fit this mold. And it feels like it's being guarded. You know, there's a culture, workplace societal culture that's very carefully guarded, and they don't want to let go of it because then maybe it's a house of cards. You know, maybe everything that they know and believe will start to fall apart, which, by the way, is part of a country developing and modernizing and being multicultural.
And you are actually quite politically active, as far as I understand. I mean, you joined political parties. A little bit better than me, I guess. But I had to remain as neutral as I guess.
Well, I couldn't vote. You know, I lived in this country since 2004.
Yeah.
I still haven't been able to vote in a parliamentary election.
That's true. That's the same with me. I'm still waiting for my citizenship at the moment. So
if I'd moved to Sweden, I could have voted in 3 already.
Yeah.
Not that I want to move to Sweden, but you know what I mean? It seems like that's really tough. So yeah, that's why I got involved with politics, because I am politically active, and I felt like I needed a way to have an influence.
Yeah, and I think that I've seen that through the work you've done, especially working with NGOs as well. I think that you want to see change, and I think I think we also discussed a little bit on how these recruiters actually see talent as well. You know, and I think like having someone being involved in trying to create that society, and if they bring us along with it, I think that we would create some kind of changes.
Diversity is a strength. You know, as a leader, I believe that the worst thing I could do is hire a bunch of people who all think the same, have the same backgrounds, approach problem solving in the same way. Yeah. And there's many dimensions to diversity, like you say. You know, personality types, or you know, just approaches, or age, or lots of things. But I genuinely think that it's in every Norwegian employer's best interests to start to address that imbalance that there is, because I just think it makes your organization weaker, less good.
Yeah, and also like you also personally have a personal issue that affected quite a lot of people, and when you told me this, I was shocked, and that was to the AOS scandal. That has deeply impacted you. So.
Yeah. So part of the deal when you live in Norway, Scandinavia, is we have this fantastic I'm a big fan of the welfare model. Yeah. You know, we pay our taxes and it goes to a social safety net. If something happens, you lose your job, or you know, something happens that you're not on your own. So I'm part of you could say a group of people who are European migrants. Most of us came as adults. Most of us came to work. Because of the way Norway has interpreted its legal obligations to us as a group through the European Economic Area agreements, we've basically been denied for many years that social safety net. So in my case, I'd already lived in Norway for a decade, and my mum, she was diagnosed with early onset dementia, and she was living alone. And while we were waiting for her to get a diagnosis actually, and then any kind of help, me and my siblings had to kind of be there for her. And it meant that I chose to move back to the UK temporarily to spend some time with her before it was too late. I just lost my mum. She died in January.
Sorry to hear that.
But this, at the time, I ended up moving in with her, and in a space of about 4 months, I was her full-time carer. You know, we had people coming and going a little bit, but I did that, and I'm glad that I did that. However, I was not able to work, and I was also being denied any right to benefit because I was physically in the UK. It turns out that the European Union has secured my rights. If I've been working and paying taxes in Norway, I have a right to that social safety net. But the Norwegian state, the judiciary and the politicians had decided they were going to try and cheat us of that. And it actually led to people being imprisoned, prosecuted, imprisoned, and forced to pay back.
Yeah.
And still now, this was all uncovered 3 or 4 years ago, and still now people are fighting for justice.
Yeah.
It's a scandal, but of course it's not a scandal that has affected the majority population, so hasn't really had very big political consequences. People don't talk about it.
No.
But the result for me is I had to manage with I didn't know when I could work again. I had to live on my savings, on top of it being very emotionally draining. I mean, it was probably the darkest period of my life, you know, watching somebody you care about fall to pieces and not be able to help them. And also, yeah, it had a big impact on my relationship. It was terrible. And I feel like there's no way this would have happened if I had happened to have a Norwegian background and my mother had lived in somewhere in Norway.
Yeah.
I would have been spared that horrendous experience. So, and that's a kind of discrimination. And
oh, absolutely. And I think it's really sad because obviously you on top of like workplace discrimination that you have to experience this, and on top of that there's another layer on a very personal, very painful, you know, moment of your life where you really would have wanted like the government and the safety net to kind of back you at that time. But you're kind of left alone, really. You're left alone to kind of financially be independent and fight for yourself and all the emotional parts. Well, you really have no break. You kind of, you don't even have that break to kind of break down.
No.
You know, and I think that's a sad part for me when you're telling me this. Just not being able to get that help when you are entitled. And for the government to do this for foreigners, because like you said, it's like, it's not, you know, the majority that's getting affected, but there's actually this proportion, you know, of people. But yet at the same time, you got Norway and Oslo, especially, I know, Oslo Business Region and you know, Oslo Alliances, where they're trying to promote Oslo as a place to go to, you know, to try and attract like IT folks to come here, but yet... They're
actively trying to undermine your rights.
Yeah.
They want to cheat you out of your rights. I mean, it's crazy to have to take on the state like some people have had to. I haven't done anything. I haven't, you know, probably have a good case for compensation. I don't have the energy for it, you know.
Right.
I just want to put a line under it. But again, this was not acknowledged. When I was talking to my friends about how messed up it was, you know, I was hearing back, well, maybe you've done something wrong, or, you know, it must be mistaken, or, you know, it can't be that bad, and it's just like, can I get some acknowledgement?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons I'm talking about it now is because I don't, let's say, you know, you're from Europe and you move to Norway today, don't be as naive as I was. Make sure you know your rights. And it's people in Brussels who are securing your rights, and the Norwegian government, time and again, have proven that they're actually finding ways to try and opt out of giving you your rights.
Yeah.
And I think it's shameful when we know we're contributing.
Yeah. And I think it's necessary to share these stories, right? Like you said, it's just not coming out. And I think we also touched on, you know, I just want to say that it's really upsetting to me because, you know, when I came to Norway, I lost my mother and I also had my daughter, and I'm still going through some of the turmoil and trauma. I'm not saying it's any way same as your experience, but I can relate in some ways, just not having that room to breathe, to kind of fall, to be acknowledged of all the things I had to go through. And especially with, you know, friends like you're saying who would have been nice if they just validated your emotion. And I just think like that communication, that they don't seem to be able to somehow. It feels really hard for them to really understand that some bad things are happening. And I think a lot in my media has a lot to play on that. And I think I just want to say sorry to hear about your mother recently passing away.
Thank you.
And I know this topic isn't easy for you to talk about, but I'm also saying thank you so much for sharing your story, because I think it's absolutely necessary for more people to hear about these things. And you are, in my network, the first person I kind of know that's been directly affected by the scandal as well. And what I wanted to kind of relate back to is also how the media is, because obviously you talked about the scandal not being like raised enough, and I don't think it is. I mean, I think I only heard about it for like a couple of weeks or something, and then there was absolutely no follow-up afterwards from the newspapers or anything,
So what I've observed in the media is this. I read the news every day, watch the news every day in Norway. Journalists are very good at it. The second there's an issue affecting somebody here, they will send a reporter out to go and interview. Who's this is your story. What's your story? You're an individual. Yeah. You're struggling with high electricity costs, like lots of people are. How does that affect you personally? And then they will broadcast this story. I don't remember seeing a single instance of that happening to these, like I said, 300,000 European migrants who've been impacted by this scandal. Where is the stories? Where's the individual coverage? Like I've told you my story now, but
right.
Why are journalists not interested in shining a light on that?
Yeah. Well, that's why the Oslo desk exists for a reason. Which, though we are a very small publication, and I don't have the, big funders, say. But you raise a really good point, and that's also what I want to tie into. Is also you were impacted by the media as well. Not only the fact that the scandal wasn't out there, raising that issue on this particular one that impacted you, but you also wrote something in media which blew on your social media. And then you got hit by a politician, right? A political party.
No, it was a right-wing blog, basically racist blog. I'll have to say, I'm not going to name them. So yeah, I am on social media a lot, and I often tweet observations. On Twitter, I will say what I'm thinking, or I'll say what I'm observing from my point of view. So one day I was walking through the central station here in Oslo, and I saw this ad campaign. I won't get into it, but I basically made a comment about how the framing of this ad campaign had racist undertones. This is the phrase I used. I didn't think any more about it. Later that day, some high-profile right-wing media figures decided to start a name and shame campaign against me, recording it out, saying, "How dare you? Say that this could be interpreted as racist. You're just and that led to me getting hundreds of messages, abusive messages, not just on that platform. People were searching me up on other platforms. They were sending me homophobic messages. Oh, wow. They contacted my employer. They wrote on the contact form on their website, like, how can you hire somebody who blah blah blah. And then there was this story in this right-wing newspaper, which again, it was just I had to just block and close, and and that was just one instance. But I just think, the people who try and raise these issues all the time, the kind of abuse they're getting, and that has a function. It's trying to silence you, and it works. I mean, who wants to put up with that? So, I mean, I laugh about it a little bit now, but it's really revealing. Like, there's a whole segment of the population that are very, very much, they're not only not ready to acknowledge discrimination and racism, they're actively going to try and harass anybody who brings it up.
Harass and silence, you to the point, because you never contacted the police, right?
About this?
Yeah.
Oh, I know that there's no point. Sadly, and I wish there was. I've worked with politicians. I've worked with politicians who've received threats of. I mean, I've also received threats of violence working in a political party, like directly on the street.
Wow.
I tweeted about that too. But no, I didn't go to the police. And politicians who receive death threats, and maybe eventually they'll get police protection, but the police aren't going to go after the people doing it. They'll get a slap on the wrist. Very rarely. Maybe it's changing a little bit now, but it's not taken seriously. But again, I'm not. I don't want to come across. I don't see myself as a victim. It's something I've experienced, and it's really thought-provoking in terms of, the effect it has on other people. There are certainly other voices who speak up who receive 10,000 times the kind of vitriol and attacks.
I think that goes to show how resilient a lot of us immigrants are, really, because a lot of times it's like we experience these things, and sometimes we don't have the time to deal with it. we kind of like you said, brush it off, or just go, okay, like this is happening, we accept it. But once this is gone, I need to get on with my life. I need to do this because it's just there's no space. And also like the support, like instruments of institutions or the police. It's like you kind of, from my sense of speaking to so many, that there's a loss of sense of that they trust us, they believe us, and that anything will come out of it, really. So what is the point a lot of time? But for you to experience like so many like messages of violence against you, threats against you, and on top of that also like physically in front of you, on the background of you having to deal with your own personal stuff, being a citizen here, and on top of that for me it feels like it's an accumulation of all these episodes and experiences. I'm just wondering how you feel about that now, having talked about it and saying, wow, actually this is quite a lot. What's going on in your mind after now that shared this layered of stories?
In terms of like the reactions that I got after pointing out the potential racist subtext of that ad campaign, I know that it wasn't about me. It was about what I represent. It could have been anybody. And again, when I was in the representing the political party, it was about the hate towards what the political party represented. But you mentioned a little bit earlier trauma, and actually I think that the sum of, I don't know, tens of thousands of tiny little microaggression incidents that you shrug off, they do have a cumulative effect on you. And they affect your self-image, they affect your entire, it affects the way I think about about Norway and my work and my opportunities, and so it has an effect. It does, and you don't realize until it starts to kind of really drain you over time. And concretely, what I have found is that when I talk to people with Norwegian background, they will often be dismissive or they will minimize. And when I talk to people who've also moved here as adults, they will have the same stories. They will never doubt me. So then you start to think, wow, this is a real thing. This is really going on, and I'm not alone in it. So my advice would be to anyone, don't just talk to your Norwegian friends. Talk to people who have the same background as you.
Yeah. So, in a sense, how do you think Norway could move forward? I mean, what kind of changes do you think, if we were to think of a solution now from the discrimination as you feel, and I ask this to everyone because I'm curious about how people think. And I always feel like in order to empower ourselves as immigrants, we need to also talk about solution. Not just like, it's important to share the stories that we've gone through, but also like how Norway should move forward. Because often I find like, you got into politics, and I'm not sure if you're still going into politics in a certain way, but I kind of feel like a lot of the, what they call the handlingsplan, which is like the action plan for the government, often excludes us as people who don't speak Norwegian fluently, as those who are born here, but we speak fluently enough to understand everything. Like, what would be a recommendation or solution to the government, or to, I don't know, solutions of where you think like that could be concrete to change, to already start some kind of changes?
So I think that as a society, we need to start facing up to the reality of it. We need to start listening to people and believing people when they share their lived experience, and understanding what the implications of that are. That's a start. I believe, there are positions of power in society. If you're running a business, if you're an elected representative, you have a disproportionate influence. You have to understand your responsibility. Ultimately, I want to see genuine representation of minorities in these positions of power. So I think the parliament and the local councils, they need to reflect the diversity that exists in this city and in this country. They don't at all. They really don't. and the same in the business world and the world of NGOs. How many of the leadership team have international background, or who've grown up with parents who are migrants? Again, you can measure this stuff. People don't want to. So I just think it's really time to have start having these discussions and get real. And what gives me hope is that Norway is one of the most progressive countries in the world in terms of likestilling, in terms of gender equality. Like Norway introduced some of the most progressive measures in the world, many decades ago, and we see now the effects of those. I'm not saying that it's perfect for women, but certainly we're closer to equality of opportunity in Norway. So where are those measures for other kinds of diversity?
Yeah. Or even like racial equality, right? Because it's like, I feel like when it comes to gender equality, I do see certain changes, but still certain people hold certain power, right? You can still have like, I don't even know if like I should, I mean like also I'm reflecting as well like how I should say this, because it's like I don't want to sound like, oh, like having Norwegian women in places of power is not a good thing. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying like, but what about the women of color where they often are marginalized, they're, not from privileged background, what can we do to lift them? And I think everyone needs to have that equal opportunity. And it shouldn't be sliced with, gender as such. Maybe intersectionality is a better word to kind of incorporate everything where everyone can get a chance. But I think, like you said, I think if we have the statistics, if we have the data, I think we can work with it. But I find that it's quite difficult here to kind of look into that, to be able to kind of have change happen, really. Is there anything else you would like to talk about that I haven't like raised yet?
I mean, if we could go back to the first-hand experience. I had a few more anecdotes and stories from that one that you maybe want to include, because it was it was multifaceted. Let's say.
Yeah.
I would like to talk about that because it's my first direct experience.
Yeah.
So yeah, this employer I was working with, it was a membership organization. So there was the staff who'd been hired, and then there was all sorts of members, a large base of members who were involved in their free time. And the staff, not just me, would often experience negative feedback from these members. We had an internal forum on Facebook, and they would not think twice about attacking you by name or demanding that you did this or that. And sometimes those were loaded, and they were, again, I was experienced, stereotyping and, having my background called into question or my experience called into question. That was hard. And I remember we had this really big event. It was kind of a launch, a really big event, hundreds of people. It was a really fantastic evening, and I felt a real sense of achievement because I've been really involved in this thing, and it had gone fantastically well. And one of these volunteers came up to me, and they obviously saw how happy and proud I was. And what they said to me, and I'll never forget, is that they said to me, I know you're in a central position now, but I hate what you represent. They used that phrase. I wish you'd never, been involved. Yeah, and I'm going to do whatever I can to undermine. Yeah, and you're taken aback. It's very hard to forget that. It certainly changed my mood. But I've never spoken about that story. I didn't acknowledge it. I didn't tell anybody else, in that organization. But it was really, I felt like the mask slipped.
And was this person in position of power, or is he like?
In a membership organization, everybody's in a position of power. You kind of have a flat structure. So yeah.
So he was literally out to get you almost, it sounded like.
And I was thinking, what did I do? What have I done I've done my job. And obviously, okay, fine, they took issue with something I did with my job. That's okay. But nobody should have to put up with that. No. And I felt it was very charged, and I think I was very called out because, again, what I represented was not a diverse organization. I was one of the few people with a foreign background. What I experienced over time as well is that actually I felt, this is very hard to prove, but I felt like my contributions were being diminished, minimized, and I got sidelined. You know, I think that what I represented was, you know, people didn't want to stand behind me in that respect anymore. And you know, you don't never know what that's about. But it's hard to shake the feeling that it may be connected to who I am and what I represent, which is just deeply unfair. You know. So I also wanted to mention the master suppression techniques. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So there is this a Norwegian sociologist developed this framework about what they call the master suppression techniques, hersketeknikker. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, the Norwegian word, yes, but the English
you didn't know what they could translate it.
It's so funny how like you stay here such a long time and then like your Norwegian English is like it's, you know, mixed all the time, and for me it's the same. So
of course.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the master suppression techniques is, I would really recommend any adult migrants to Norway to read up on these. And be aware about how they may be used against you in a workplace. They were originally used to highlight the kind of stigma that women would get from men in the workplace, particularly, or in any social setting. So the 5 master suppression techniques are being made invisible. So they basically act like you're not there. They leave you out of things, or they pretend that you don't exist. It's a kind of gaslighting. Being ridiculed. So, you know, let's say you make a suggestion, people make fun of you to keep you in your place. So we've got withholding information. So again, you turn up at a meeting and it turns out everybody else has had a meeting that you were not a part of or have already talked about what's being discussed, and you don't have a fair chance to contribute. So you have the double bind. That means like basically if you speak up, it has negative consequences for you. And if you don't speak up, it also has negative consequences for you. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And then the last one is blaming or shaming. So if something goes wrong, then they have to find a scapegoat, somebody to, and they will point to you. And this can happen, again, in very small instances, but over time, what's happening is you are being gaslit, you are being, somebody's out to work against you, or an organization actually as a whole, maybe even subconsciously. And I think that this counts double for foreigners.
Yeah.
You know, again, it's I'll be interested to hear what other people's experience is.
I think what I'm realizing is a lot of these things is very subtle, and you can only read it over time as an accumulation of these microaggressions and how it impacts you. And I think, like, you know, if I have to refer back to like our sister project with the She Witness, we talk a lot about timeline, especially with violence. It's not one single event. It's accumulation of a lot of events in the timeline. And I think that's the similarity I'm seeing with this when it comes to discrimination. Even in the workplace, what you're talking about, these hashka techniques. And I think through time, if you're working in a workplace for a year, and that one instance you already said, you know, this guy coming up to you and is like, I hate you, basically, and I'm going to do everything in my power to like undermine you and get rid of you. And, you know, that is outright. And of course, sometimes the problem is just like, you know, why in Norway people don't believe this happening is because when these incidents happen, it's not like you have a recorder.
Correct.
I mean, it's like going, okay, I predict that this guy is going to say this to me, and now I'm going to record this. You know what I mean? It's not. It's things that like pop up, right? And I think like that is the problem when it comes to these things. It's like until they actually see it, they will believe it. And I think like
even when they see it, no, there's always a deniability.
Right.
People are smarter than saying explicitly, you know, I'm not going to hire this person because they're foreign.
Right.
Or I'm not going to listen to you because you're foreign.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to promote somebody with less experience over you.
Yeah, so in the sense that when they do see it, they also deny it.
Correct.
so you're kind of like, yeah.
Not always, but a bit too much. So as you say, the cumulative effect is what starts to mean something, but it's hard to get it in black and white. But again, I have had it in black and white. It's been said, these things have been said to me openly in meetings with 30 people there, written in black and white in an email. And nobody has come to me and said, this is out of line, or...
Yeah. And I think it's very draining over time. Like you said, it's really draining emotionally, and you almost don't want to. I mean, of course, like I've seen institutions are saying like, oh, speak up, go to the police and do all these things because then we have statistics and stuff. But it's the process of actually accessing those services as well, and having to repeat the trauma basically. When you're telling your story, it's very difficult, and I don't think like here they quite mastered how it is for us to kind of meet their system, because it's very tough.
Yep.
And because it's an accumulation of not just that one event at the workplace where you could have spoken to your HR or even to your union, but on top of that you have to deal with your UDI issues. On top of that, your personal issues.
Absolutely.
I can only imagine if you were sick at the same time, what are you going to do?
Yep.
It
takes a lot of it to go back and basically re-traumatize yourself, or actually hold your hand up and say, yes, I've been a victim to something. That takes a lot. I can understand why people won't get to that point. I'm only getting to that point now, and that's because I feel solid and safe in where I am otherwise. It's really deeply unfair, and as you say, there are layers to it. You don't want to get in trouble with the authorities if you're at the authorities' mercy for having your rights enshrined, as I was until recently. Getting my citizenship, it took 16 years.
Are you ever scared at any point when you feel like if you could reach out to any institutions or anything, do you feel like at any point scared of speaking up? Say for example, if you do go to police or if you go to your HR, in those spaces, is there any moment where
It's intimidating.
Yeah.
I think maybe it would, less for me. I don't know. I feel like confident going in and talking and interacting with people from the state generally. But also you're very afraid of making a mistake or revealing something that you shouldn't, or, there's always all sorts of dimensions to it. You could get in trouble for doing something. But I would say that I follow the news and I follow legal cases, and it's I do feel a kind of sense of pointlessness, like hopelessness, because very often employers and the state itself, unless there's really hard and fast proof, they're going to be let off the hook for it. And also in my case, this organization I work for, it wasn't a profit-making enterprise. It was an enterprise which I spent 5 years of my life trying to contribute to. I don't want to cause them any damage.
No.
So you just think, well, would I achieve anything? I can speak out about it, and I can make people aware about it. That's a start. But yeah, it takes energy. It takes energy to go and fight, take the fight.
Do you think there's hope in the future? I mean, do you think there is some speck of hope? I mean, for me, like, we're talking about systemic changes, and it takes time. And honestly, for me, like every single time I hear like it's gonna take time, I get so frustrated that I'm just going like, no, it's not gonna take time. It's not gonna take time as long as leaders like have the willpower. I think everything can be done. I guess it comes from like the very Chinese, the dictatorial kind of. I was like, I don't mind being a dictator at this point, because it's like if I can change something, I would probably do it. But like, I don't know. For me, it just feels like it shouldn't take this long. And honestly, I mean, I feel like we're living in a society where you got technologies like speeding its way, with trend, and what you just need is the mind power of those in leadership and in power to actually go, we need it now. That's how I feel. And I think both of us coming from the UK, we're so used to people going out protesting and saying we demand change. I feel like the more we wait, the more suffering that I'm going to see and hear continuously. And I think like, I often want to end these episodes where there was some kind of hope. Yeah. But I often find it really difficult because like, you're saying this and I am saying this like from my own work and my own observations, that when does this end, So
my answer to that, I recognize and I agree with a lot of what you said. But my answer to that would be, there is definitely hope. In my lifetime, as a gay person, I've experienced a revolution in my rights and my freedoms. And this happened in a relatively short period of time. So that gives me hope. I love working with and meeting younger people. And I think that a lot of these, the way that the rest of society is obsessed with putting everybody in boxes, I don't think they're they're quite so obsessed with that. That gives me hope as they grow up. At the same time, we can't be naive. You know, there are decision makers, people who decide laws. I would really encourage anybody to get involved politically, try and stand for election yourself, or, you know, work to get somebody else elected who gets it. You know, that is a very constructive and a very real way of bringing about change.
Great. And I think I'll leave it on that note. So, all right. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.